If you enjoy stories that send chills down your spine and keep you coming back for more, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me bring more terrifying tales to life, and I'd love to have you as part of this growing community of horror lovers. Thank you for your support. It means the world to me. And before we dive into tonight's story, I'm curious. What time is it where you're watching, and what country are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to see where all our horror-loving friends are joining from. My friend and I decided to take a 3-day overlanding trip through the dense, remote trails between Wisconsin and Illinois. It was supposed to be an escape, a chance to unwind from the grind of work. The trails were rough, scattered with fallen trees that blocked our path. Fatigue crept in as we spent hours cutting through the debris to clear the way for our vehicles. By the second day, the weather turned against us. Lightning illuminated the dark woods, and torrential rain transformed the trail into a treacherous swamp. A creeping unease settled over me, a feeling I couldn't shake. Something about the woods felt wrong. Late that evening, as we struggled through the muddy trail, we realized we weren't alone. Through the sheets of rain and swaying trees, we glimpsed a massive, hulking figure. It was at least 10 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur, and moved with an unnatural grace for its size. It followed us, keeping its distance at first, but then it charged. With terrifying strength, the creature smashed into my friend's car, almost flipping it over. The impact was deafening, and panic set in. We tried to outrun it, but the off-road conditions made it impossible. Mud sucked at our tires, and the beast's speed outmatched ours. The creature leapt onto my friend's hood, pressing down with a force so immense that the car couldn't move despite the pedal being floored. I reversed my vehicle in desperation and rammed into the beast. My car shuddered like I'd hit a tree, but it gave us a moment of reprieve. My friend, thinking fast, hooked the winch from his car to the creature. With the winch engaged, he reversed at full throttle, dragging the monster through the mud and stones. The creature struggled fiercely, roaring in pain, and then it did the impossible. It snapped the winch cable. As it stood, towering and enraged, I knew we had no time. I grabbed my camping knife and charged, but the beast swiped me with one powerful arm. Pain exploded in my chest as I was flung through the air like a rag doll. I landed hard, ribs broken, barely able to move. The creature advanced, its glowing eyes locked on me for the kill. And then, bang! A gunshot rang out, followed by 5 more. The beast roared in agony and collapsed inches from where I lay. My friend stood a short distance away, rifle in hand, shaking but alive. The last thing I remember before passing out was the sound of the creature's labored breathing fading into silence. I woke up in a hospital bed, battered and barely breathing. My friend had saved me, carrying me out of the woods and rushing me to safety. When he reported the incident to the police and forest rangers, they searched the area but found nothing. The massive beast had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the scars on our bodies and our minds. In 1988, I was living life on my own terms, a self-made loner content with my own company. The solitude of the forest and the eerie calm of abandoned places always called to me. Camping was my escape, a way to feel alive. One summer night, I decided to take my adventures to the next level, seeking out an old, forgotten fire lookout tower deep in the wilderness. It had been abandoned for years, its weathered wood and rusty railings standing as a monument to the past. I figured spending the night up there would be an experience unlike any other. As the sun began to set, the view from the tower was breathtaking. The wind was a steady, comforting breeze, and the forest below stretched endlessly in all directions. For a while it was peaceful, the perfect setting for a quiet night under the stars. But peace turned to terror just after midnight. I heard something moving in the distance, a crunch of leaves, a snap of branches. At first I thought it might just be an animal, deer maybe. But the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, like something was walking directly toward the tower. My heart started to race, but I stayed still, listening intently. Then I saw it. Emerging from the tree line was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was massive, easily 9 feet tall, its thick fur dark and matted. It moved with unnatural speed and strength, its eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. My body froze as I watched this hulking figure start climbing the tower. Every step it took made the old structure groan under its weight. I had no choice but to prepare myself for the worst. Gripping my knife, I braced for what I knew was going to be the fight of my life. When the creature finally reached the top, I was face to face with it. Its breath was hot and heavy, its growl low and menacing. It lunged at me, and I barely dodged its first attack. The force of its swipe knocked me against the railing, and I felt the wood splinter under the impact. We fought for what felt like an eternity. It came at me again and again, its claws tearing at my skin, leaving deep gashes across my arms and chest. I could feel my strength fading, the blood loss making me dizzy, but I refused to give up. Every time it lunged, I countered with my knife, slashing at its hide, drawing blood. The creature roared in pain, a sound so primal it shook me to my core. Finally, in a stroke of pure luck, or maybe desperation, I managed to land a blow deep enough to make it stagger. The creature let out a final, ear-piercing roar before retreating, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had come. I collapsed against the tower's railing, gasping for breath, my body covered in wounds. I couldn't believe I had survived. Even now, years later, I still bear the scars from that night, both physical and mental. I've never been able to explain what that thing was, or why it attacked. But I know one thing for sure. I'm lucky to be alive. Every so often I find myself thinking about that night, wondering if the creature is still out there in the woods, waiting, watching. It was a dark, rainy evening, and the weight of my life's collapse hung heavy on my shoulders. My wife and I had separated after years of trying to make it work, and to top it off, I'd lost my job. I was in a downward spiral, aimless, broken, and desperate for an escape. So, I packed up the few belongings I had left and hit the road for a trip with no destination, just to clear my mind and maybe find some meaning in the madness. I drove deep into the wilderness, far from civilization, where even my GPS had long given up. The road wound endlessly through towering trees and shadowy forests, and I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that I was being watched. As dusk turned to night, I realized I was nowhere near a motel or even a sign of life. That's when my car sputtered, jerked, and finally died, leaving me stranded on a desolate road. I got out, slammed the hood shut in frustration, and cursed my bad luck. It wasn't long before I heard it, a low guttural growl echoing through the trees. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Sasquatch? It's just a legend, right? Something kids tell around a campfire. But the sound grew louder, and as I turned, my blood ran cold. There, standing in the middle of the road, was something out of nightmares, a massive, hulking figure covered in matted fur, with eyes that gleamed like dark coals. Sasquatch was real, and it was right in front of me. Before I could react, it charged at my car, pounding its massive fists on the hood, shattering the windshield with terrifying force. I scrambled out, grabbing the only thing I had for protection, an old revolver with just 4 bullets. My heart pounded as I ran into the forest, branches snapping underfoot as I tried to lose the creature in the dense woods. I ran for what felt like hours until I stumbled upon an old, run-down cabin. It looked abandoned, falling apart, but it was my only chance. I burst inside, slamming the door behind me, trying to catch my breath. The silence was overwhelming, but I knew it wouldn't last long. The creature was hunting me. Suddenly, the walls shook as the Sasquatch slammed into the cabin, roaring in fury. I fired blindly, one shot after another, but it wasn't enough. The beast broke through the door, and in the chaos, it slashed at me with razor-sharp claws tearing into my skin. I was bleeding, barely holding on, but I couldn't give up. With trembling hands, I loaded my last bullet into the revolver. I could feel the beast's breath on me as it lunged, ready to end my life. In one last desperate move, I pulled the trigger. The bullet hit its mark, and the creature let out an ear-splitting howl before collapsing at my feet. I fell to the floor, barely alive, my body torn and broken, but somehow, by a miracle, I had survived. I passed out in that cabin, unsure if I'd ever wake up again. It's been 30 years since that night. I never told anyone my story. Who would believe me? I'm an old man now, and as I sit here looking out at the world I once knew, the memories of that night haunt me. The scars on my body are a reminder of the impossible thing I survived, the legend that turned out to be real. And even now, as I close my eyes, I can still hear it. that growl echoing in the darkest corners of my mind. I was driving cross-country, the kind of road trip where the endless highway is both freeing and unsettling. I'd been on the road for hours, heading to a destination that no longer mattered. The only thing on my mind was finding a place to crash for the night. My eyes were heavy, the coffee I'd downed earlier doing little to keep me alert. That's when I saw the faded, flickering sign of a rundown motel off the highway. It looked abandoned, but I was desperate. I pulled into the gravel lot, dust kicking up as I parked. The place had seen better days. Paint peeled off the walls, and a lone street lamp buzzed weakly, casting long shadows in the deserted lot. No other cars, no signs of life. But the neon sign blinked vacancy, and I figured it was good enough for a few hours of sleep. Inside, the air was musty, and the old man at the counter barely looked up when I asked for a room. His voice was a rasp, warning me to stay inside after dark. I thought he was just another weird local, so I shrugged it off and took the key. Room 7 was just as dilapidated as the rest of the place. The bed creaked when I sat on it, and the only light was a dim bulb swaying from the ceiling. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and sat on the bed, flipping through the static-filled TV channels. That's when I heard it. A distant howl, long, guttural, and unmistakably close. I froze. At first I thought it was a coyote, but the howl came again, louder this time and closer. My heart raced. Something wasn't right. The wind outside picked up, rattling the old window frames, and then I heard a scraping sound, like claws dragging against wood. My eyes darted to the window. Through the grimy glass, I saw something move. A shadow, huge and hunched over, prowling just outside. My breath caught in my throat as the shape came into view. It wasn't human. A massive creature with glowing yellow eyes and matted fur stood on two legs, sniffing the air. Its snout was long, filled with rows of sharp teeth, and its claws. I knew those could rip through the thin walls of this motel like paper. I'd heard stories of things like this but never believed them. A werewolf. No, this was no legend. This thing was real, and it was hunting me. I grabbed the only weapon I had, my hunting knife still sheathed in my backpack. My heart pounded as I stood in the dark room, every second feeling like a lifetime. The creature outside sniffed again, and I heard the scraping of claws as it started to circle the building. It was coming for me. Without warning, the window shattered, and the beast lunged inside, its massive frame barely fitting through the broken glass. I ducked just in time, rolling across the floor as it snarled and swiped at me with razor-sharp claws. I felt the air whoosh past my face. My hands trembled, but I gripped the knife tighter. It stood between me and the door, its head low, growling as it prepared to attack again. I had no choice but to face it head-on. With a scream, I charged, knife in hand. The creature swiped at me, catching my shoulder with its claws. Pain seared through me, but adrenaline surged, keeping me on my feet. I plunged the knife into its chest, sinking the blade deep into its thick hide. The werewolf howled, its blood, dark and foul-smelling, spattering across the room. It fought back, throwing me to the ground, its jaws snapping just inches from my face. I could feel its hot breath, see the madness in its eyes, but I held onto the knife, twisting it deeper. With a final, desperate push, I shoved the blade upward into its heart. The creature's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment it froze. Then it collapsed on top of me, its body convulsing as it let out a final, haunting growl. I rolled out from under it, gasping for breath, covered in its blood. The room was silent again, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stood up, trembling but alive. The werewolf lay still, its monstrous body slowly reverting to something more human. I stared down at the thing, knife still clutched in my hand. It was over. Or at least I thought it was. But as I backed away from the lifeless form, I couldn't shake the feeling that this night wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. I stood over the creature, my chest heaving as the adrenaline slowly drained from my system. The room was a wreck, broken glass, deep claw marks gouged into the floor and walls, and the foul stench of blood in the air. The werewolf's body lay motionless, its form grotesquely shifting between beast and man. For a moment I thought it was finally over, but then something happened that made my blood run cold. The body started to twitch. It was subtle at first, Just a small jerk of the hand, but then its entire body convulsed, bones cracking and reforming as it slowly began to shift back into its human form. I watched in horror as the fur receded, the claws shrank, and the snout collapsed inward, leaving behind the naked, battered body of a man. His face, pale and gaunt, was twisted in agony, but what chilled me to the bone was that his eyes were still open, and they were staring right at me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. I had killed it. I had killed him. Before I could process what was happening, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. The kind of steps that made your skin crawl. I gripped the knife tighter, ignoring the pain searing through my shoulder where the wolfman had clawed me. My instincts screamed at me to run. But something, curiosity, or maybe sheer terror, rooted me to the spot. The door to the room creaked open, and there stood the old man from the front desk. His face was shadowed, but I could see enough. There was no fear in his eyes, no shock at the scene of carnage before him, just a knowing, almost resigned look. "So," he rasped, stepping inside, "you met him?" I stared at him, confused. What is this? What the hell is going on?" He didn't answer at first. Instead, he walked over to the body of the man, no longer the terrifying beast I had fought moments ago, and knelt down. With a sigh, he closed the dead man's eyes. "Been happening for years," he said quietly, almost to himself. "This place, it draws them in. Him, the others. Not sure why, but they come. Always have." I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. "Others?" The old man nodded. "You think he was the only one? There's a reason I keep this place so quiet. The wolves, they come with the night, every full moon, one by one. Sometimes they take a man's form, sometimes a woman's, but they always come." He glanced at me, his eyes cold. "And when they do, they don't leave without blood." I backed away, feeling the room closing in around me. "Why didn't you warn me?" He stood up slowly, brushing off his knees. "Would you have believed me? No one ever does." He turned his gaze to the shattered window, where the wind was howling outside. "You were lucky tonight. You fought. Most just don't." I was still trying to process what he was saying when another sound cut through the eerie silence, a low, distant howl. This one wasn't close, but it wasn't far enough either. The old man's expression darkened. "You need to go," he said, his voice hard. "Now." My heart leaped into my throat. "There's more?" He nodded grimly. "You killed one, but where there's one, there's more. They hunt in packs, and once they've tasted blood, they won't stop." Panic surged through me. "Then why are you still here? Why don't you leave?" He gave a hollow laugh. "This is my place, my curse. I can't leave." He tossed me a set of keys. "But you can. Take my truck. It's out back. Get as far away from here as you can, and don't stop, no matter what you hear, no matter what you see." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my backpack, not even bothering to look back at the wreckage of the room, and bolted out the door. The howls were louder now, more of them joining in, a chorus of death echoing in the distance. True to his word, the old man's rusty truck was parked behind the motel, hidden from view. I jumped in, fumbling with the keys as I shoved them into the ignition. The engine roared to life and I floored the gas pedal, tires skidding on the gravel as I peeled out of the lot. The road stretched out before me, empty and desolate. The howls faded behind me, but I could still feel the presence of something lurking, something watching from the shadows. The old man's words echoed in my mind. They hunt in packs. As I sped down the highway, the darkness swallowing the road ahead, I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw something, a figure, a shadow running on all fours, keeping pace with the truck. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't stop. I didn't dare. The miles passed in a blur, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting its cold light on the world below. My shoulder throbbed, the wound deep, but it wasn't the pain that scared me. It was the possibility that the old man had been right, that I was marked now, that the wolves would follow me no matter where I went. And as the first light of dawn broke on the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The wolves were still out there, and they would always be hunting. It started like any other off-road adventure, me, my trusty rig, and a weekend in the wild. The plan was simple: conquer the infamous Frostbite Ridge, a remote stretch of rugged terrain deep in the mountains. Known for its bone-chilling temperatures and unpredictable weather, the ridge was a badge of honor among off-road enthusiasts. My rig, a customized monster with oversized tires, a winch, and enough horsepower to climb the gates of hell itself, was more than ready. Or so I thought. As I climbed higher, the crisp mountain air turned icy, and the once distant peaks now loomed like sentinels watching my every move. The radio signal had died hours ago, leaving only the rhythmic growl of my engine to keep me company. The trail grew narrow, the rocky terrain more treacherous, but I thrived on the challenge. Until disaster struck. A sharp, metallic crunch echoed through the valley as I attempted to crawl over a particularly gnarly rock formation. My rig lurched, the engine sputtered, and I came to a dead stop. Cursing, I climbed out to assess the damage. One glance told me everything I needed to know. The front axle was shattered. No amount of mechanical prowess could fix it here. I was stranded, alone, with nightfall closing in. I decided to stay put for the night. My rig was a fortress, and I had enough supplies to last a couple of days. As the sun dipped below the peaks, an eerie silence blanketed the landscape. It was the kind of quiet that made your skin crawl, broken only by the occasional whistle of the wind. Then came the noise. At first it was faint, just a low, guttural growl carried on the wind. I told myself it was a mountain lion or a wolf, but as the hours dragged on, the noises grew louder and closer. Heavy footfalls crunched through the snow, circling my camp. I flicked on my rig's floodlights, scanning the perimeter. The beams illuminated nothing but swirling snow and jagged rocks, until they didn't. In the corner of my vision, something massive moved. I whipped the lights toward it, but whatever it was had vanished. Heart pounding, I locked myself inside the cab and grabbed my shotgun. The growls grew into bone-chilling roars, and the footsteps now sounded like thunderclaps. Something, or someone, was out there, and it wasn't afraid of me. The first strike came without warning. A deafening bang rocked the rig as if a wrecking ball had slammed into it. The entire vehicle shook violently, and I heard the unmistakable sound of metal bending. Gripping the shotgun, I peeked through the windshield, and froze. Standing just outside the floodlight's reach was a figure. Not a man, but a towering beast covered in matted white fur, its eyes glowing like embers. It was the Yeti, the mythical guardian of Frostbite Ridge, or so the locals whispered. I had dismissed the stories as campfire tales, but here it was, all 9 feet of it, glaring at me like I was an unwelcome guest in its domain. The beast let out an ear-splitting roar and lunged, claws as sharp as blades raked across the hood, peeling the metal back like it was tinfoil. I fired a shot through the windshield. The blast echoed through the night, and the Yeti stumbled back, but only for a moment. Its roar of pain quickly turned into one of fury. The chase I couldn't stay in the rig. If I did, I'd be ripped apart. Grabbing my emergency pack, I kicked the door open and bolted into the snow. The wind howled as I ran, my boots crunching through the drifts. Behind me, the Yeti's heavy footsteps closed in, each one reverberating in my chest. I stumbled down a slope, nearly tumbling into a frozen creek. The beast roared again, now just yards away. Desperation fueled me as I spotted an old hunting cabin in the distance. The roof sagged under the weight of snow, and its windows were dark, but it was my only hope. I reached the cabin and slammed the door shut, barricading it with a rotting table. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scanned the room, a rusted axe, a lantern, and a half-empty bottle of kerosene. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The Yeti didn't make me wait. The door shook violently as it slammed against it, each hit threatening to tear it off its hinges. I doused the axe in kerosene and lit it with the lantern, creating a makeshift torch. The door shattered, and the Yeti barreled in, filling the tiny cabin with its monstrous presence. Its stench was overwhelming, a mix of wet fur and decay. With a primal scream, I swung the flaming axe. The beast roared as the fire singed its fur, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it swiped at me, its claws tearing through my jacket and grazing my shoulder. Pain exploded through me, but I didn't stop. I swung again, the flames catching on the cabin walls. The fire spread rapidly, illuminating the beast in a hellish glow. It lunged, pinning me to the ground, its jaws snapping inches from my face. My free hand groped for anything and found the kerosene bottle. I smashed it against the Yeti's head, soaking it in fuel, and thrust the torch into its chest. The beast howled, a sound so terrible it made my ears ring, and stumbled back, engulfed in flames. It thrashed wildly, crashing through the walls and disappearing into the night, leaving a trail of fire and smoke. I stumbled out of the burning cabin, clutching my bleeding shoulder. The Yeti was gone, but its roars echoed faintly in the distance. Somehow, I had survived. The next morning, a rescue team found me wandering near the trailhead, half frozen and babbling about a monster. They chalked it up to hypothermia and trauma, but I knew the truth. The Yeti is real, and it's still out there guarding its icy kingdom. And if you ever find yourself on Frostbite Ridge, stranded and alone, pray that your rig holds up, because once the Yeti finds you, there's no turning back, until they didn't. I bought my old RV for cheap about 5 years ago. It's nothing fancy, just 4 wheels and a roof over my head. Sure, it has its quirks. The engine likes to sputter, the fridge hums louder than a diesel truck, and the lights flicker if you don't fiddle with the wiring. But it's mine, and I've always prided myself on fixing things myself. This weekend, I decided to head out to a remote spot deep in the woods. I'd been there before, a small clearing by a pristine lake, surrounded by towering pines. No cell signal, no people, no drama, just the way I like it. The RV gave me its usual trouble before the trip. The starter wouldn't crank, the water pump groaned, and I had to patch up a leaky window. But by the time I hit the road, everything seemed to be running fine, or so I thought. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The sun was dipping behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the dirt path leading to the clearing. As I parked and shut off the engine, I noticed how quiet it was. Not the usual kind of quiet. This was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the low hum of the RV's cooling fan winding down. I shrugged it off and got to work setting up camp. I started a small fire, cooked some canned stew, and settled into my favorite folding chair to watch the stars. The solitude was perfect. Just me and the vast dark woods. But then I saw them. Lights. At first I thought they were fireflies darting through the trees. But these weren't fireflies. They were too bright, too steady. They hovered in the distance, weaving slowly between the trees. My stomach tightened. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out here. Probably just some hikers, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease. But as I watched, the lights moved in patterns that no human could replicate. They'd flicker, vanish, and reappear in entirely different spots, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. I told myself not to panic. Grabbing my flashlight, I decided to investigate. I wasn't scared, just curious. I've always been good at keeping calm in situations like this. The fire crackled behind me as I stepped into the woods, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The lights vanished as soon as I got close. The woods seemed even quieter now. The kind of silence that presses down on your ears. I turned back toward camp only to realize I'd wandered farther than I thought. The RV was nowhere in sight. Great, I muttered, trying to retrace my steps. That's when I heard it. A faint clicking sound like 2 rocks tapping together. It came from behind me. I froze, heart pounding, and slowly turned the flashlight in the direction of the noise. The beam landed on something. It was crouched low to the ground, its limbs impossibly long and thin, almost like twisted branches. Its skin was pale, stretched taut over its bony frame, and its face, if you could call it that, was featureless except for 2 glowing eyes. The clicking grew louder as it straightened to its full height, towering over me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear. But then I heard a guttural rasping sound. It took me a moment to realize it was laughing. The thing was laughing. I bolted. My legs felt like lead, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I stumbled through the trees, branches clawing at my face and arms. I could hear it following me, its clicking echoing through the forest. Finally, I saw the faint glow of my campfire. The RV was just ahead. I dove inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. The RV rattled as I leaned against the door, panting. For a moment, all was still. Then the lights appeared again, circling the RV. They moved faster now, erratic and chaotic, as if taunting me. The clicking sound grew louder, coming from all directions. I grabbed the keys and turned the ignition. Nothing. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. "Not now, you piece of junk," I yelled, slamming my hand against the dashboard. The RV shook violently, as if something massive was pushing against it. I could hear the laughter again, this time right outside the window. Desperate, I fiddled with the wires under the dashboard, hot-wiring the engine like I'd done so many times before. The engine roared to life. I threw it into gear and floored it, tearing out of the clearing and onto the dirt road. The lights followed me for miles, weaving through the trees like ghostly sentinels. It wasn't until I hit the main road that they finally disappeared. I didn't stop driving until I was back home, the RV sputtering and wheezing as I pulled into my driveway. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty street, trying to make sense of what had happened. I haven't gone back to that spot since. The RV still gives me trouble, but I've learned to appreciate its quirks. At least it's something I can fix, unlike whatever I saw in those woods. Some nights, when I'm working late on the RV, I think I hear the faint clicking sound again. But I tell myself it's just the tools, just my imagination. At least that's what I hope. I'll never forget the hunt that changed my life. It was meant to be a simple solo trip, me, my rifle, and the wilderness. After days of planning, I loaded up my old truck and headed deep into the mountains, away from civilization. There's something about being alone in the wild that clears your mind, but this time the silence hid something I'll never fully understand. I set up camp in a clearing near a creek. The air was crisp and the forest felt alive. The first couple of days were uneventful. I hunted, cooked over a fire, and listened to the distant howls of wolves. On the third night, things started to feel off. Around midnight, I heard a low, guttural growl outside my tent. Not the kind of growl you'd expect from a bear or mountain lion. This was deeper, almost human. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, stepping out into the cold night. The forest was eerily quiet, except for the faint crunch of something heavy moving just beyond the tree line. I shouted, trying to scare whatever it was away, but the sound only stopped for a moment. Then, from the shadows, I saw it. Him. A massive figure, easily over 8 feet tall, stepped into the moonlight. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting my flashlight. Its hair was thick and matted, and the stench it carried was unbearable. Bigfoot. I'd heard the stories, but I never believed them. Instinct took over. I raised my rifle and fired a warning shot. The creature didn't even flinch. Its guttural growl turned into a roar that shook me to my core. I fired again, this time aiming straight at its chest. The bullets had no effect. It took a step toward me, then another, its massive hands reaching out. I panicked and unloaded my rifle. Shot after shot, the creature just kept coming. My bullets might as well have been pebbles. Before I could react, it grabbed the barrel of my rifle and wrenched it from my hands like it was a toy. I wasn't about to die without a fight. I grabbed my hunting knife and lunged, slashing wildly. The blade barely scratched its thick skin. It roared in anger and swatted me aside like I was nothing. The force sent me flying into a tree. My chest ached, and I tasted blood, but adrenaline kept me moving. As I staggered to my feet, the creature closed in. Its massive hand wrapped around my throat, lifting me off the ground. I felt the life draining from me as its grip tightened. My vision blurred, and I thought it was over. But fate wasn't done with me yet. In a desperate struggle, I kicked wildly, and my boot hit its face. The creature recoiled, loosening its grip just enough for me to break free. I stumbled backward, my foot slipping on loose dirt. Then I fell. I tumbled over the edge of a high cliff, crashing through branches before plunging into a freezing river below. The water knocked the wind out of me, but it saved my life. The current carried me downstream, far away from the beast. When I finally crawled onto the riverbank, I was battered, bruised, and barely alive. I don't know how long I lay there before I mustered the strength to move. By the time I made it back to my truck, the sun was rising, and the forest felt strangely calm again. I never told anyone about what happened, not fully. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw. That thing wasn't just an animal. It was something far more powerful, far more ancient, and it's still out there. I was a young man in my 30s when I bought the land, a dense patch of wilderness that seemed to stretch forever. My wife and I dreamed of raising our children there, teaching them to hunt and fish, and building something timeless, a cabin that would hold the stories of our family. Those were good years. We spent long days hammering nails into timber and evenings by the fire, laughter echoing through the woods. Now, decades later, the cabin stands alone, its wooden walls weathered by time, but its spirit unbroken. My wife is gone, my children grown with families of their own, and I often find myself yearning for those days. That's why I returned, to sit by the same fire, feel the weight of those memories, and honor the life we built. But something else has claimed the land. It started the first night I arrived. I felt it before I heard it, a presence, heavy and oppressive. The woods, once so familiar, seemed darker, the silence sharp and unnatural. When I stepped onto the porch, I noticed footprints in the soft earth. They were massive, too big to belong to any animal I'd ever hunted. I dismissed it as paranoia, a trick of the mind brought on by loneliness. But the unease only grew. As the nights passed, I caught glimpses, a hulking shadow slipping between trees, the crack of branches that shouldn't have been there, and a low, guttural growl that reverberated through my chest. This wasn't a bear, this wasn't human. I'd heard stories about the Sasquatch, tales shared over campfires, but I never put stock in them. Now I wasn't so sure. This thing wasn't just passing through. It was watching me, testing me. It didn't belong here, not on my land, not where I built my family's legacy. I couldn't let it take that away from me. Determined, I spent the next day setting traps. Rusty snares and spikes from my hunting days, crude but effective. I pulled my old rifle from its case, the same one I'd taught my son to shoot with. It felt heavy in my hands, like the weight of all those years. When night fell, I waited. The first trap snapped shut, the sound like a gunshot in the stillness, but then came a roar, angry, primal. I caught sight of it as it barreled toward the cabin. It was massive, covered in dark fur, its eyes glowing with an unnatural intelligence. I fired. The bullet struck its shoulder, but it barely staggered. It charged, smashing through the traps like they were twigs. I shot again and again, but nothing stopped it. It lunged at me, claws raking through the air. I felt a sharp pain as I was thrown against the wall, my breath knocked from my lungs. This thing was stronger, faster than anything I'd ever faced. Somehow, I managed to scramble outside, my ribs screaming in protest. My truck was my only chance. I dove into the cab, slamming the door shut just as it reached me. It clawed at the metal, leaving deep gashes as I floored the gas, gravel spraying behind me. I barely escaped with my life. Now I sit at home, my wounds healing but my pride bruised. That land, that cabin, it's mine. It holds the best parts of my life, and I'll be damned if I let that creature take it from me. This isn't over. I'm going back. Next time, I'll be ready. Whatever it takes, I'll reclaim what's mine. Because that cabin isn't just wood and nails, it's a piece of me, and no monster, no matter how strong, will take it away.